Okay, welcome to my satin stitch tutorial. This is going to be a rather lengthy tutorial. I want to try to give you as much helpful information as I can based on the success that I have found through a lot of practice with satin stitch. It started off as one of my least favorite stitches, and now it is actually one of my favorites. I really think that once you get the hang of it and the feel for it and practice it a lot, it's one of the more efficient ways to fill in a basic shape, and it just can be so useful, and you're probably going to encounter it in a lot of different types of patterns. So it's definitely a good foundational stitch to learn and gather some tips and tricks about. The first thing I want to note is just that there's a few things aside from learning the stitch that can set you up for success when you're doing satin stitch, and one of those is making sure that your fabric is nice and tight. This goes for all stitching with hand embroidery, but definitely with satin stitch it's super important. You want your fabric to be very taut. So if you hear this, you can see there's no give and it's almost like the surface of a drum. That's going to help you just keep your stitches even and looking nice as you're stitching. The other thing that may lead you astray when working with satin stitch is if you're not using the right size needle. So typically, if I'm working with 3 or 4 strands or less, I like to use a size 5 DMC needle, or just a size 5 needle. This is the kind of needle I use most often with my embroidery, so this is just a really versatile one. If you're going to be using like 5 or 6 strands, you may want to switch to a needle with a little bit of a larger eye, like a size 22 or 24 chenille or tapestry needle, and that'll just allow you to get more of the threads through the eye of the needle and work with your satin stitch. So typically when I am doing satin stitch, I like to work with 3 strands. I find that it's a nice number of strands to still help my thread lay flat as I'm stitching and give it that nice satiny look, without having to do a whole bunch of extra work. So we're going to get started with this square, and we're going to do a basic satin stitch, and then I'm going to show you a whole bunch of other tips and tricks to learn with satin stitch as well. So I've got some thread here. I'm going to split this into 3 and 3 so that I have 3 strands to use. Again, I just have really found that I love working with 3 strands whenever I'm doing a satin stitch, because it's enough that it fills in the space kind of quickly, but when you work with all 6, that's sometimes when I feel like the threads start to get twisted and they don't lay as flat, but 3 I find still lays pretty flat. So one thing you can do is just kind of run your hand down the thread and just sort of get it nice and flat before you start stitching. I'm going to tie my knot in the end here and go ahead and cut that off. So let's start with the basics of how to satin stitch. I'm going to be working on this square over here, and I'm going to be doing a satin stitch vertically, so up and down. The very first thing that I like to do is pick a spot somewhere in the middle of the shape for my first stitch that I'm just going to do a little straight stitch. And the reason that I do this is so that the knot that's on the back of my thread that holds it in place is not going to get in the way of where I am trying to stitch each time. So if I want to start on this side, I wouldn't have a knot there each time that's going to be getting in my way, if that makes sense. So that's just a little trick that can help you get your knot out of your way. So I'm going to start at this end over here, and I'm going to come up at the top of the shape, and I'm going to pull down. Sorry, this is getting blurry. Here we go. I'm going to pull straight down with my thread, and I like to use my thread to help me. I use it as a directional guide. So I'm pulling this straight down, and I can see where I want it to end up. So I'm just going to push it a little bit to the side and then make my down stitch with my needle right there. And I like to hold the kind of excess thread until it gets close to going through. That is something that can sort of help you to get it lay more flat so it's not twisting as much when you are stitching. Now I'm going to come back up on the other side right next to my first stitch, and you really want to just try to come as close to it as you can and really right next to it if you can. So you can sort of feel around until you see that the needle is coming up right next to that first stitch. And I'm going to pull it straight up. And then I'm going to make my down stitch right next to my first down stitch. So I can kind of feel with my needle where that one is and just slide it over a little bit and make my next down stitch. So now I've got my first 2 stitches. I'm going to come back up to the top of the shape and come up right next to this previous stitch right here. I always like to come out through the fabric on the same side of the shape each time. So I'm actually working my way back to the top of this square each time and making my down stitch on the same time. This helps keep your threads tighter, and I just think they look neater and you get a better feel as you're stitching. So I'm working my way across here. So I like to kind of feel where the last stitch ended and then move my needle over just a little bit. So I put my needle actually into that same hole almost, but then just move it over just a little bit to make my down stitch. That way everything's staying nice and lined up. You can see that straight stitch we originally made at the beginning is going to get completely covered up in just a moment here. So this is the very, very basic way to complete satin stitch, but I'm going to give you some other options that might help you on the next shape. I want to show you how to tie off a knot when you're doing satin stitch in the back, whenever you need to tie off and get more thread, which I'm just about ready to do. So I'll show you how to do that right now. I'm going to flip this over. And when you are tying off a knot with satin stitch, you just want to be a little bit gentle so you don't pull any of your threads all together. So I'm going to run my needle under a nearby stitch, and I'm going to try to get underneath just one of them, not a bunch of them. And then I will leave a little loop and put my needle through the loop and then pull. And then I might go a little bit just over and do that one more time. Now I can cut off and rethread. I'm going to finish filling in the rest of this shape. So this one I'll get all filled in, and then I'm going to show you an option for outlining your satin stitch that may help you as well. Just a quick note here, since I'm starting with a new thread right now, again, I'm going to do that little trick where I just kind of make a straight stitch in the middle so that my knot is not getting in my way, and then I can continue on stitching. So I'm going to come up right here next to this stitch. And then I'm going to feel where my last stitch was, put my needle there, and then just slightly move it over. And continue until I have this whole shape filled in. Okay, so I have that first shape all filled in. You can see it's got a nice satiny look to it, and it looks really pretty, and the edges are pretty even. So with this little rectangle here, I want to show you a couple of things that might help. One is going to be outlining your satin stitch to help with your start and stopping points, and the other is going to be giving yourself some guidelines. So the first thing I'm doing here, and again, I'm going to be using 3 strands of thread for this, is I'm going to do a simple back stitch to outline the shape that I'm working with. And this is actually going to get completely covered up with our satin stitch, but it can give you a little bit more of a better guide when you're placing your satin stitches. So I'm going to completely outline this shape with a back stitch to start. Okay, so I've outlined this rectangle with a back stitch. I didn't do a great tracing job here, so I kind of tried to correct it with my back stitch. But again, I'm going to just start with that little straight stitch in the middle. And now I'm going to start over here. And I'm going to go right over this line that I did of my back stitch before. And I'm going to work on the outside of each back stitch from the top and then towards the outside of them on the bottom. And sometimes that can just kind of help you make sure that you're starting and stopping in the right place every time. So another thing that you can do though is you can give yourself some guidelines. So right here, I'm going to come up right on the outside of this back stitch, and I'm going to use my thread to pull straight down so that I know that I have a nice straight line here. And then I will push it aside just a little bit and make my down stitch on the exterior of that back stitch outline that I have. And now I might just skip over a little bit more, like a stitch length away, pull my thread straight down, use it as a guide so that I have the same direction. I want my lines to be as parallel as possible. And then I can kind of see where that ends, just push that thread to the side a little bit and make a down stitch. And I can go all the way across like this, making myself these little, I call them direction lines or guidelines. I'm gonna do one more. Just like so. And then I can go back and just fill in between all of these. So I'll come up right next to this one and I'm going to fill in everything all the way to the edge here. So I'm just going to go to the outside. So I'm completely covering up my back stitch outline that I did before. So this is definitely something that can help you make sure that you're starting and stopping at the correct place every time so that your stitches all kind of line up at the end. Mine got a little tiny wonky in direction there, but I can even it out at the end here. I'm just going to keep going. I'll just come up in the same spot right here and finish this up. So now I have this whole side done, so I'll go back to this side of one of my guidelines and continue filling in the opposite direction until I get this whole shape filled in. Okay, so apart from my kind of wonky tracing there, I think this rectangle looks pretty good. One thing you can kind of do is you can take the blunt end of your needle and just sort of comb through a little bit when you're done with satin stitching, if things are just sort of not laying exactly how you want to. This doesn't really do a whole lot, but it's kind of fun, and you can just kind of help things get sort of separated and look a little bit neater. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to fill in a rounded shape, or the way that I like to fill in a rounded shape. And then we'll move on to kind of like a method for flower petals that are going to be bigger on the edge and work towards, you know, a similar center point. I've got a couple of kind of wonky shapes, like a heart and this just abstract shape to show you how to fill in. And then finally we'll end with how to work around interior elements when you're doing satin stitch. So there's a lot more that we can still talk about that can hopefully help you here. All right, the next thing I'm going to share is how I like to fill in a shape that's a little bit more rounded. So I'm going to start with my little straight stitch in the middle so that the knot is in the middle. And again, I'm using 3 strands right now. I will show you on the flower down here what I do if I like to use more than 3 strands, but we'll get to that in just a minute. So I like to start with one stitch all the way across the middle, all the way down. Obviously that wasn't quite in the middle, but that's okay, it'll still work. Okay. So then I'm going to fill in on either side of this stitch, and I want to think about like shortening the length of my stitches with each stitch. So on this next one, I want to come up next to my first stitch, but I want to come up maybe just a little bit below it, like I'm following the curve of this sort of oval or ellipse shape. And on my down stitch, I want to come up right next to this one, but I want to come up just ever so slightly above it so that I'm just kind of shortening the length of that stitch, if that makes sense. So in this next one, I want to come up next to it, but just really slightly below it. Actually, this one I'm going to do about the same just because there's a little more width here. And I'm just going to really try to line up with the edges of the curve for each stitch. So this next one I'm going to come up a little bit below and make my down stitch down here a little bit above. I'm going to come up a little bit below that stitch and to the side of it. And for my down stitch, I'm going to come up a little bit above this stitch right there. And as I get to the edge here, I'm going to continue that. Oops. Got a little bit of a knot here. There we go. Okay. And you'll see that it just starts to give the effect of that rounded edge that we're looking for. And as you get to the edge, your stitches are going to just start getting much shorter in length. So I'm really starting to shorten them here. And this one I'm going to make quite small to really round out the edge here. I might do just one more right here that's going to kind of start here and then sort of work into the same down stitch place right here. That really helps kind of round it out. I'll go back and do one more right here. This is something you can do if things don't look quite how you want them to. You can kind of go over where you've already stitched. Just to sort of fix it. Oh, that got a little wonky. See if I can even this out a little bit. So I'm just going in and filling in a little bit since my shape got a little bit wonky here. Okay, so then I will go back over to the other side and I will repeat that for the other half. So I find with rounded curved shapes, it's easier to start in the middle and then work your way out on both sides. Okay, so I finished up the other half, so I've got this kind of rounded shape. I went a little too far on this side, as you can sort of see. I could have just stopped one stitch short and I would have had that nice, perfect round oval, but that's okay. It's never perfection when we're stitching, and I don't really try to aim for that. I try to have fun when I'm stitching, so it's okay if it's not always exactly perfect. So I'm going to move on to this flower, and I'm going to show you what to do if you want to use like 6 strands to make it really nice and chunky. So if I'm using 6 strands, I'm going to grab all 6 strands here. And one thing that you can do to sort of help them lay flat is to separate out all 6 strands individually and then put them back together. So I'm literally going to take this apart and get all 6 strands by themselves. So this is, to be 100% honest with you, not something I choose to do super often because I never feel like I really have the time. But it can help your threads lay a little bit more flat and less twisty if you're trying to use more strands. Typically why I like to stick with 3 is that they usually lay pretty flat, 2 or 3 strands, without having to do this. But with 6, it definitely can get twisted. So I've separated them all out, and now I'm gonna put them back together, lining up the ends of each one. And I'm just sort of running my finger down each time to join them together smoothly. Got 4. Here's 5 and 6. I'm gonna take my scissors and just cut off a little bit right here so it's all even. And then get those through my needle. This time I'm gonna use my needle that has a little bit of a larger eye, my tapestry or chenille needle. And I'm just gonna run my fingers down this a few times to sort of get them all kind of back together. And you can feel that they're laying nice and flat. I'll tie my knot in the other end. Now I'll show you how to stitch in like a basic flower petal shape. So here's the thing about flower petal shapes. They are a little bit trickier because you have all this space out here, but you're working towards a similar center point each time. So there's a couple of things that can help you with this. Number 1, I'm going to start with my little straight stitch in the middle again so that my knot is not near the edge. This will get covered up each time. I like to do a stitch right in the middle of the petal, right towards the center to start. So I'm going to use my thread, I'm going to pull it down, and I'm just going to move it ever so slightly to the side so I can get my down stitch right where I want it at the center of that flower. And then I'm going to repeat that on the sides of the petal. So I'm going to come up just a little bit below the sort of like tip of the right side, and I'm going to stitch this like diagonal line in and get that filled in. This one, it does not need to go all the way to the center. I'm actually going to make it stop just a bit above. I'll repeat that on the other side. So now I've got some guidelines in to help me with this flower. The thing you have to be careful about is if you consistently stitch into the same spot every time, it's going to get really, really tight and hard to push your needle through because there's so much thread there. So you don't have to stitch into the center each time. You can go a little bit above it. So I'm going to skip a little bit of space and I'm going to go a bit above the center, like to right here. And then next to that, I might go all the way to the center this time. Same on the other side. This one right here, I might make go not quite to the center. And then for this one, I'm going to go all the way to the center. So I kind of like to alternate. And I'm going to repeat this on the other side. So I'm going to come up right here about halfway between the center and the edge. This one's not going to go all the way to the center. It's going to go right about to here. But this one on this side of it will go all the way to the center. This one I might be able to get to go all the way to the center too. It's not feeling too tight yet. I might go right here. This one's gonna go a bit above the center. This one can go all the way. And then with this, let's see, I'll do one more right here. And then the very center one, I will go all the way to the center this time. So now I have that whole petal shape nice and filled in. It looks really beautiful, it looks really thick and chunky. The 6 strands does look really nice, I will say, when you want just it to stick out a little bit more on your project. So that's an option, and hopefully that helps you with flower petals that can just sometimes be a little bit tricky. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna fill in is this heart. So these two right here are just gonna be little quick examples I wanna give you of kind of like different sorts of shapes, and you can kind of think out of the box of how you might fill it in, because obviously we could just go vertically on this shape or we could go horizontally, but I like to sometimes use the lines of sort of different or wonky shapes to help me with choose my direction. And I'm actually going to fill in this heart at a diagonal. So I switched back to 3 strands just because I love the 3 strands. And I'm going to fill this heart in at a diagonal. So I'm going to use this kind of side of the heart right here as a starting point. I'm going to pull my thread up, and I'm just going to go till about where it kind of stops as a straight line. And then I'm going to fill in some guidelines. So I'm going to skip a little bit of space and come up to the edge of this curve. And I'm going to use my thread as a guide, and I want to get these 2 lines as parallel as I can. So those look pretty parallel, so I'm just going to kind of put my needle right underneath that thread there and make a down stitch across. And then I'll go right here and do the same thing. You could also use like a pen like a Frixion heat erasable pen to make yourself your guidelines if you wanted to, if that's easier than using thread. But I find that the thread works pretty well. You just have to kind of move it a little bit to make that down stitch. So I have a lot of really nice guidelines in here now, so now I can just go through and fill in between all of my guidelines, and that will help me keep my direction similar the whole time. So I'm going to start with this little rounded edge first, and as this is a rounded edge, I'm going to just practice making my stitch lengths a little bit shorter each time to achieve that look. Okay, so now I'll go to the other side here and fill in the rest of the heart. Remember, you can always kind of put your needle down into the hole of the previous stitch and then just move it over a little bit to where you really need to make your down stitch. So thinking of shapes sometimes working at a diagonal really can help you to fill them in a way that you might not have thought about before. You don't always have to work straight up and down or straight across. we can choose different directions to fill in our shapes with satin stitch. And that's something that's really helped me be able to fill in more unique and interesting shapes as I've learned to work with this stitch more and more. I'm actually going to come over here now next to this one and work my way back in between these two. And I just have a little bit left to fill in over here. I'm just about out of thread, so I'll finish up. I think you get the idea. And next we'll fill in this little abstract shape over here to my right, just as another quick example. Okay, so for this shape right here, again, I'm going to choose to work this one from a sort of diagonal direction. So I'm going to pick somewhere, actually I'm just going to do my little straight stitch to start here. I'm going to pick somewhere kind of in the middle to start, and I'm going to pull this across at a diagonal, and I'm going to go through the whole shape and make as many guidelines as I can, using my thread to help me again get those parallel lines. So then I'll come over here. I'm going to see if I can get one to go all the way across here. Yep. And then this one will go maybe from like right here down to here. And I'll do one right here. This one should just about line up. So now I can just fill in all of these sections to get this whole shape filled in. So I can't say it enough, guidelines are such a helpful tool when you are doing satin stitch. Especially with shapes that are not so uniform. I'm just going for as long as I can until I can pull all the way across. So I think this one's going to have to stop right about here. This next one I might be able to pull all the way down across the shape. And then I'm going to come over here and fill in this little side. Oh, got that a little bit messed up. That's okay. Let me just go over that one. So hopefully you get the idea here. Once I finish this little side, I would just go over and continue filling in the rest of this shape. So those are some tips with helping with different kinds of shapes that you might encounter in a pattern or project. All right, the last thing I want to show you is how to work around other interior shapes if you're trying to do a satin stitch and it's around other things, which definitely intimidated me for a very long time. This time I'm going to use 2 strands just to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like. When you're doing satin stitch around things that are on the inside, I feel like the less strands you can use, the better, just because sometimes there might be really tiny detail areas, like right here, where I'm going to need to make some very small stitches. So 2 strands would be a great one here. 3 would work too. So I'm just going to start with a little straight stitch. I think I forgot to say, always fill in or stitch in those interior elements first. That way you can kind of pick and choose where you need to start and stop your satin stitch versus doing the exterior first and then having to like build these other stitches into it. Because with satin stitch we can kind of like, you know, work around things, and if it needs to go a little bit longer here because I made this stitch a little bit shorter, we can do that. So I like to do the interior elements first and then do my satin stitch. I traced this house a little bit wonky, so I'm going to kind of use my thread to help me make a nice straight line here to start instead of the line of the house. So for as long as I can, I'm going to just pull straight lines all the way down. And then whenever you get to whatever it is that you're trying to work around, you're just going to adjust the length of your stitches to work around that. So I'll run into that when I get to the window here. Again, my tracing was not the best here, so bear with me on my stitches. So this is probably the last one I might get all the way up close to the window here. And then I'm going to go underneath the window and fill in everything underneath the window. And I would also repeat that on the top of the window. So now that I got all that filled underneath the window, I'm going to fill in everything on top of the window. These are going to be some nice little stitches because this is a pretty small space. So you can kind of think of it like as if you were doing a coloring page, right? You don't want to color over things that are already there. You just want to work around them. So it's the same way I would color if I colored into here. Once I finish here, I can just make my stitches the length of the full house siding again until I get to the door. And then I would need to shorten them and work from the top of the roof down towards wherever the door comes to each time. Full length of the house, above the window, below the window, and then to the side. So this just gives you an idea of some simple tips with helping satin stitch around interior elements or designs. All right, so that concludes my satin stitch tutorial tips and tricks, and hopefully you learned a few things that are going to help you along your journey with becoming more comfortable with satin stitch. And please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content on my YouTube channel. Drop me a comment if you have questions or if there are other things that you're hoping to see next, and hopefully you'll join me again soon.